I had a bananas reading month in November. I'm talking banger after banger after banger. Out of the 8 books that I read, only 1 book came in under below 4 stars, and I had 5 books rated 4.5 or higher. It was my highest star rating average month of the entire year. So excuse me if this video is mostly me just like gushing over each book, but I think this really highlights the benefit of following creators that vibe with your taste, listening to your community when they highly recommend books to check out, combine that with my own due diligence and researching these books before I read them. And I was just dialed in. And separately, you may be asking, like, how did I read that many books? And I've got a video where I talk about how to read more, where I use examples from my routine. I think most of the answers are in that, so check that out. So we're going to talk about these from lowest rated to highest rated. They're books from multiple genres. We did history, science, fantasy, fiction, and I'll try to qualify the genre of the book as we work through them. I also want to know the best book that you read in November. So comment that while you're hanging out. And while you're at it, if you feel like dropping a like or subscribing or ringing the bell and so on, that would be tremendous. No pressure though. I just appreciate you being here. Now let's get into this stack. For my lowest rated book, I'm sad to say it was the History Sickos Book Club read for November, and it's one that I was really looking forward to. It's The Anarchy, The Relentless Rise of the East India Company by William Dalrymple. Now, as the title suggests, this is about the disintegration of India and the East India Company coming to rule over large parts of India due to the events that largely occurred during the second half of the 18th century. Now, this was not a bad book. I don't want to give that impression. I gave it 3.3 stars. And on my rating scale, like a flat 3 is like a book that I read and I'm completely neutral on. So I'm slightly above that in my opinion of this book. And seeing as I have a series in progress where in each video I review 3 books from the History Sickos Book Club that I've read, I'll keep this one brief and I'll save the longer thoughts for that video that I shoot later. Here's what I wrote in my short review of it for the club. Quote, "Judging strictly on information and what I learned, this was quite good. It's the writing style that didn't vibe with me. The massive blocks of quotes were more intrusive than useful and would have been better suited being summarized or used more selectively in shorter clips. It contributed to what was a somewhat laborious/dull read at times. It also assumed a base of knowledge that I did not possess in most cases, and I would not recommend this as an introduction to the subject. In areas where I had prior knowledge, the book flowed better and enhanced my overall understanding of events," end quote. Now that last part is more for potential readers rather than a knock on the book itself. But like I said, overall, the writing style held this one back for me, which is surprising because I've seen so much praise for Dalrymple. So that's not the case for everyone, but unfortunately it was for me. Now we take a jump into the 4-star books that I read in November with a flat 4-star rating for Pathogenesis, A History of the World and Its Plagues by Jonathan Kennedy. Now personally, I think the UK title, How Germs Made History, is the more effective title at setting expectations for the reader, but regardless, this book argues that bacteria and viruses have directly shaped our existence and success as a species. And it is really full of like fascinating information and theories. Where the book really shined was at the outset, in the beginning, where we talk about prehistoric infectious diseases, which have been called the loudest silence. Now, this makes the convincing argument that in the showdown between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals 50,000 years ago, our ancestors had germs on their side, which combats the theories presented in books like Sapiens and Gun, Germs, and Steel, while enforcing the theories from books like The Dawn of Everything, which I would recommend reading that. I was cross-referencing those the entire time while reading this. There are other more modern chapters that I enjoy too, like the one entitled Revolutionary Plagues, where it's argued that fevers in Panama helped birth Great Britain, that mosquitoes are the founding mother of America because of how malaria devastated British troops. And it points out how a slave's malaria immunity, due to coming from specific parts of West Africa, garnered higher prices for that slave. Now, I did find the truncated history, especially in the more modern sections of the book, lacking some important context and led to the science of it to drift into less persuasive and more speculative anecdotal arguments, like that the plague turned Rome into a Christian empire. Essentially, the strength of the book, that it's accessible and comparatively light, also works against it in some areas. And overall, It is a solid 4-star book. It works as a great introduction to this type of transdisciplinary genre that blends history, science, and biology. Next up with a 4.2 rating is The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James, which is about the first successful slave rebellion in history. This took place in San Domingo, which is modern-day Haiti, and covers a period from 1791 to 1803, where San Domingo was a French colony with severe and brutal conditions for its slaves. There is a slave-turned-commander with a name that I won't butcher by trying to pronounce it. It's right here on the subtitle. And through him, we explore how the inner workings of the revolution unfolded, starting with black slaves rebelling in relatively small numbers and eventually becoming a force to be reckoned with. This also explores the relationship between slavery and capitalism. And make no mistake, James, who is a Trinidadian historian, is also a Marxist. That may sell you on the book. That may turn you off. But for me, there were interesting arguments made that weren't without merit. This is also a bottom-up history. And oddly enough, the introduction to Pathogenesis, which I read right after this, has a passage explaining what that means quite well. So I'll just quote from Kennedy here. Quote, "This approach focuses on the masses of ordinary men and women, often fighting against exploitation and oppression. In this view, it is the cumulative impact of their struggles that drives progressive social, political, and economic transformation." He continues, "The idea of history from below is much more inclusive than the worship of a few heroic individuals," end quote. Now that's interesting because this type of social history didn't really start to bloom in prominence until like the 1960s. And this book was published in 1938. So James was a bit of a revolutionary himself in this regard too. Now, this book has become a classic, and it's iconic when it comes to like the Haitian Revolution studies, and for good reason. It's a darn fine read. The only flag that I throw up here is that I wish I knew more about the French Revolution coming into it. It's just a weird blind spot for me to have, but it's not something that I've read deeply about. And I think having more background knowledge there would have helped, but it didn't impact my experience much. Now, I mentioned up top that I have 5 books that were 4.5 stars or better, and we're getting into that bucket now. So let's go with a 4.5 star fantasy book read. The Children of Gods and Fighting Men by Shauna Lawless. This is book 1 in the Gale Song trilogy, and it's a wonderful mix of 10th century Irish history, folklore, and mythology blended together to create just a vibrant world. Our 2 main POVs are on the opposite sides of this conflict. You've got a woman with the power to heal, and she is struggling with her role as a spy. And my favorite, Gormla. She is a widow of the King of Dublin who has designs on the throne for her son. And she is very much giving Cersei Lannister, I mean, unhinged in the best way. She'll do anything and everything to advance the interest of her and her family. She is not a good person, but she is an amazing character. And she brings this sense of like wild unpredictability to the story. She is my people. I'm rooting for her to do all of the crime and none of the time. So in this, you've got this political intrigue as a through line that works brilliantly for me. And the writing itself is so smart and efficient. The prose isn't sparse, but it's not like overindulgent. The pace is perfectly balanced. The use of magic is discreet, but works well in giving the plot more depth. The world building is seamless. It seems everything has a purpose and there's zero fat to cut. It's very polished and efficient. There's no major negatives that I can find in this. I gave it 4.5 stars. It's a tremendous opening to this trilogy, which I will definitely be continuing because I need to know what Gormla will do next. Highly recommend. Let's go with another fantasy book. 4.6 stars for The Fury of the Gods by John Gwynne, which is the 3rd and final installment of the Bloodsworn Saga. So I mentioned that The Children of Gods and Fighting Men was a mix of Irish history and mythology. This series is that, but with the Vikings. And it's such a tremendous world. I talked about this series in my fantasy starter pack video, so go check that out if you want more details. But yeah, this is great for both new and hardened fantasy readers. I also interviewed Gwynne, and we hit on a range of topics relating to this series. So there's that, if you're interested too. One thing that Gwynne is known for is his battle scenes. I mean, the guy does battle reenactments in his spare time, so that like really shines through in this. And that's a good thing for this book in particular, because this is the most action-packed book that I've read from him. I mean, we go several stretches where it's just bang, bang, boom, action, action, action. And this led to a couple of spots where I thought the pacing was a touch off. But I mean, the guy danced with the girl who brought him there, right? And I won't knock him for it. This is everything that he had in The Shadow of the Gods and The Hunger of the Gods turned up to 11. And it's a very satisfying conclusion to this trilogy, which I would recommend again to just about everyone. I also gave this book 4.6 stars, but I would give it the edge, considered by some to be the greatest novel of all time, or at least one of them, Stoner by John Williams. Now, at the time of this filming, I finished this a few days ago, and I'm still processing my thoughts on it, which is a credit to the author. I've actually reached out to other creators that have read this to try to get a better understanding of my personal reactions to it. And the following days and weeks of processing this, at times beautiful book, may alter that star rating over time. And I think I'll have more to say about it at a later date. Now, again, that says something about this book, which is that the author is really causing me to have a hard think on how we explore the themes and the characters and whatnot. And to boil it down, this is about a farmer turned academic who lives a pretty mediocre life and has his fair share of disappointments that through his passivity, he just kind of comes to accept. And some say he's a sympathetic character. Williams says that he's a quote unquote real hero. And I'm not sure yet if I agree with either of those, but I think everyone would agree that he's like sort of this everyman character. And this is not fast-paced at all. It's not an explosive book. This is a character study where we ruminate on things like love and passion, existentialism, suffering. I think the prose itself is excellent, and the questions that it asked are superbly woven in. But I have one big thing that I'm grappling with, and that's the women in the story and how they're portrayed. And I actually went out and tried to find a bunch of reviews by women to kind of like see if I get the same sense. And I haven't yet. It's weird. It's been difficult for me to not judge this book with contemporary sensibilities in some respects. And I don't have a great grasp on how my modern concerns would have been viewed by those who read it in 1965. Like, how much can we expect from the writer in this regard? This is why I want to have those discussions about the women in this book and Stoner's interactions with them and Williams's writing of them, because it's a major factor holding me back from just slapping a 5-star rating on this. But I'm still kind of exploring this. So yeah, I really appreciated this book in the main. And it's one that's going to have me thinking about it for a long time. And that's huge, right? Hit me with your thoughts on it in the comments and let me know if you see what I'm getting at and like how you process that when you read it. I would appreciate it. We have arrived at our top 2, and at number 2 is another history read, White Malice, The CIA and the Covert Recolonization of Africa by Susan Williams. This starts in 1958 with the Hands Off Africa Conference in Ghana, which marked a significant period for Pan-Africanism, and this was a display of political unity among emerging leaders. However, just as Europe was being pushed out of Africa, Africa comes under assault from foreign intervention from the U.S., for reasons mostly relating to the Cold War and uranium, subverting the African independence movements. Williams is meticulous in her research as she reveals how covert CIA operations use a variety of underhanded methods to destabilize nationalist leaders like Nkrumah of Ghana and Lumumba of the Congo. I hope I pronounced those correctly. This alters the continent's future. This flies in the face of the narrative that African nations failed to build effective democracies independently, a narrative that Williams exhaustively and effectively combats. And it really is stunning how deep and wide the CIA penetration of Africa goes. And Williams does a terrific job putting all of these major players involved on both sides of it under a microscope so we can get a better understanding of them. Like, that level of detail just gradually adds up throughout the book. And it's honestly like shockingly overwhelming at times. So I really love this book, but what kept me from it giving like a clean 5 stars, these are minor gripes, but mainly there was too many inconsequential figures that don't overtly impact the narrative given brief profiles. This thing could have easily been 50 pages shorter on that alone, like easy. Now, it does build the sense that, holy heck, right? Like the amount of CIA links and activity is bonkers, which it was, but I could have figured that out without the exact names and sometimes fairly weak 6 degrees to Kevin Bacon type connections being spelled out every time. And regarding the U.S. not wanting the Soviets having a monopoly on uranium through their relationship with Lumumba and the Congo, I never got a sense of whether this was an overblown or legit concern for the U.S., right? Like, spell out the geopolitical fallout of America's nightmare scenario where Russia gets control of the Congo, for example. Now, that might be my own personal ignorance, and I think I understand why the author didn't do this because, number one, the book is not entitled The CIA's Uranium Cold War. That angle serves more as a through line. And even just asking the question can make it seem like I'm justifying or sympathizing when that's not the case. Now, either way, the point is that the U.S. clearly ham-fisted its way through several events, especially regarding Nkrumah and Lumumba, regardless of the strategic geopolitical realities. Maybe that's my curiosity getting the best of me. Still, it felt like a very important point that wasn't really fleshed out all the way. Putting that aside, because again, those are minor gripes. Williams is a darn good researcher and writer. She had me locked in on this puppy from the opening pages to the end. It's incredible stuff. I was both informed and enthralled by this. Props to her. This is an excellent book. My top book of the month is Red Country by Joe Abercrombie. Now, it's kind of unfair to the other amazing books because I love the First Law World so much that this was a reread for me. I've talked plenty about Joe Abercrombie and the First Law World in other videos, so you can check out my ramblings there. Point being, don't trust me on Abercrombie because I'm just going to give everything 5 stars because I love it that much. I'm very biased. This is book 6 in the First Law World, and it's the 3rd of the standalones. I think it's so impressive that Abercrombie's standalones can go from revenge story to war story, and with Red Country, just big Western vibes. And he pulls all 3 off so well. Now, Red Country has some revenge vibes, but there's also a more familial element to it. There's a more of a survival element as they adventure through this harsh frontier. It's about confronting your past and growing as individuals to find out your personal identity. I think those things separate it from the other standalones, and they're done just incredibly well. And this was my least favorite of the standalones the first time around. And that hasn't really changed, but I think I am bumping this up in my overall world rankings because the emotional beats in Red Country, I mean, they're just terrific. And I gained a deeper appreciation for the character work, especially with Shy, Temple, and Lamb. Even though I still think that some of the tertiary characters don't work as well in this one as they do in the others. And this isn't to say that you're going to feel the same. I've noticed a trend in others I've talked about it with where people that didn't like the heroes as much, which is a book 5, they're the ones that tended to really love Red Country, so they flip the rankings that I have. I think of all the First Law books, I've seen the most variance on where people place Red Country, and I struggle to place it too, honestly, because again, even though I rank it in the bottom half of the book 10 or the 10 book world, I still loved every page, and I still gave it a clean 5 stars. Boom. That's it. 8 books in November, a ton of bangers. Crowding the 4.5 to 5 star range. Hopefully we get that again in December. Again, let me know the best book that you read in November. As always, I'm looking for your recommendations so I can keep this streak alive. I'll catch you on the next one. I appreciate y'all.